Today we're going to take cell energy notes, specifically on photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So you may have heard of one or both of these processes, but we're going to take a deeper look into them in order to continue our plant investigation. So the first thing you need to do is at the top of your notes is write the essential question. The question is, how are photosynthesis and cellular respiration similar? So at the top, write your essential question. How are photosynthesis and cellular respiration similar? So before we dive into photosynthesis and cellular respiration, we need to start with a story. And this story takes place in the 1700s with a person named Joseph Priestley. So Priestley took a candle. He had like a mason jar or bell jar, put the jar over a lit candle, and as you could predict, the flame went out. So what he reasoned was that the flame must need something in the air, and that when whatever that thing was in the air disappeared, the flame would go out. So then he was like, why not try a couple more things? And so he decided, I'm going to put a little mouse under the jar. So he had the candle, the jar, and a little mouse. And so what happened is, as you could guess, both the candle went out and the mouse didn't fare so well either. And so when things go wrong, why not experiment some more? So in this case, he tried again with a new mouse, had the mouse, lit the candle, put a mint plant there, and covered them all with a bell jar. Now this time, what do you think happened? So right, in this case, luckily, this little mouse got to survive, the candle stayed lit, and something was observed about the mint plant. So, after this experiment, Priestley concluded that the plant must give off what? So hopefully you can know that based off of his results, the candle stayed lit, the mouse that of course takes in oxygen is still alive, that the mint plant must be giving off oxygen. So that's as far as he got in that experiment. Now years later, another scientist by the name of Jan Ingenhousz kind of carried on Priestley's experiments.
His test was simple. He collected leaves from his garden and he put them in water. Ingenhousz then observed his experiment. When watching plants, patience is important. Ingenhousz believes that if he puts plants under water, any gas given off will rise to the surface as bubbles. This will give him a clue as to how plants grow. As much as he tried, he could not get any of his submerged leaves to give off any gas, until one day his attention is caught by a sample in a shaft of sunlight. Once again, Ingenhousz observes his experiment. After just 10 minutes, something really interesting is happening. Sample in the shade, same old story, nothing. But the sample in the shaft of light is different. Tiny bubbles of gas are emerging from the leaves. For Ingenhousz, this was a really exciting moment. For the first time, he had made the connection between sunlight and the production of gas in leaves. Ingenhousz proves that plants exposed to sunlight do indeed give off a gas. Now he wants to find out what that gas is. The tiny bubbles of gas that have been released by the leaves have accumulated in the top of the jar. And if I take this glowing splint and put it in there, it reignites, indicating the presence of oxygen.
Okay, So as you can see, both Priestley and Ingenhousz confirmed that oxygen is produced by plants. Now, what Ingenhousz contributed was that this only happens when the plant is exposed to light. So sunlight in this case is an essential part for a plant to be able to produce that oxygen gas. So moving on from here, in 2011, a professor from Plymouth University decided, hey, I'm going to be a human bell jar experiment person. I'm going to lock myself in a sealed container for a couple of days with only plants, no air going in and out, just to prove that plants can give us oxygen. So this professor locked himself up in this bell jar and had no problem. Everyone was around. The news people were checking him out. He did fine in there, except when it got dark. That's when he started getting headaches. That's when he started getting dizzy. So why is it when he's in this locked-in, sealed room with plants that all of a sudden at nighttime he was having a problem breathing and all that? So why don't we pause the video and have a chance for us to think with our partner, how come he was doing fine in his sealed-in container with the plants, but then all of a sudden, once night came, why was he getting dizzy? Why was he getting headaches? What was going on in that situation? Okay, so hopefully you said something like, in order for plants to even produce that oxygen, it needs to have sunlight. So if it's dark and the sun's not out, those plants cannot go through the process that allows them to give oxygen out. So that's why the professor was starting to get dizzy. The oxygen levels inside of the jar was decreasing. So just as a recap, we know that the results of Priestley's and Ingenhousz's experiments showed that what is necessary for plants to produce what gas. So hopefully you know by now that they proved that light is necessary to produce oxygen. This has to do with one of the processes of today's notes. This leads us into photosynthesis. So Priestley and Ingenhousz were exploring something that would later teach us about a process that plants do all the time. This process is when green plants use energy from the sunlight to convert water and carbon dioxide into sugar and oxygen. So this is part of your notes now. You should be writing these words in the blanks. So photosynthesis is the process where green plants use energy from the sunlight to take water and carbon dioxide and make that into sugar and oxygen. You know that this takes place in the chloroplasts. So if you're done writing, why don't you take a look at this picture and notice how it's showing water from the rain clouds is coming in through the roots. That water combined with the carbon dioxide that the plant is taking in, as well as sunlight, can be used to produce something called glucose, a sugar, and oxygen. So another way you can look at this is in this picture. We know that part of the ingredients for photosynthesis, the reactants for this reaction, is that plants take in water. We know that. We know that they have roots for that. They take in carbon dioxide. We also know that. And they use sunlight to make it into sugar. We know that because we know what chloroplasts do. So when we're memorizing this equation, we just have to think about what plants do. We know that they take in carbon dioxide from the air. We know that they take in water with their roots. We know that they need the sun. So we already know the ingredients. The reactants that you should be writing down right now are carbon dioxide plus water in the presence of sunlight will make something called glucose, which is a sugar, and oxygen. Carbon dioxide plus water in the presence of sunlight produces glucose, which is a sugar, and oxygen. So yes, you will have to memorize this, but like I said, if you just think about it, you know that the things that plants need to live are the ingredients. So it needs carbon dioxide, it needs water, it needs sunlight, and as a result, it makes something called glucose and releases oxygen. We definitely know that because we can appreciate that quality. So moving on from here, I want you to, in a moment, talk to your partner and explain what is going on in these pictures. So with your elbow partner, you're going to explain what's going into the plant, what's coming out, what process is this in general. So take a moment, pause this video. Okay, so hopefully you said something like, these images are showing photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process where plants take in carbon dioxide, take in water, and in the presence of sunlight, produce glucose and oxygen. So moving on from here, not only can you describe photosynthesis with words, but you can also use a chemical formula to explain it. So the chemical formula that you will also have to write down is it's 6CO2 plus 6H2O in the presence of light makes C6H12O6. That is the chemical formula for glucose plus 6O2. So when you're writing this in your notes, just like when I say water, another way to say water is H2O, I'm having you tell me photosynthesis in its chemical formula form. So 6 carbon dioxides can also be worded 6CO2 plus 6 waters, 6H2O with light. 1 glucose, that would be C6H12O6 plus 6 oxygens, 6O2. So for this chemical formula, it's just something that we'll have to also learn as we go, but the more we practice, the better we'll get at it. Okay, so we've learned photosynthesis. We know that plants take in carbon dioxide from the air. They get water with their roots. They use the sunlight to make sugar, glucose, and release oxygen. So now what? We have all this glucose, hooray, wonderful, all is well. Not quite. Well, if you remember, we like a form of energy that is called ATP. So do plants. So ATP is just the kind of energy that organisms can use to function. While glucose sugar is great, it's kind of like if you dug into the ground and found oil. I can't just take that oil straight from the ground and put it in my car and use it to drive. I need to convert it into a usable kind of energy. So for organisms, we like glucose, but we need to convert it into ATP energy. So the next step is to use the organelle that can do that. So think back, what organelle can take sugar and change that into ATP energy? Well, that's my favorite. That's the mitochondria. So moving on, the second process we're learning about today is called cellular respiration. And this, unlike photosynthesis, takes place in the mitochondria. So as a recap, remember that plants produce glucose, that's sugar, when they do photosynthesis. So in the presence of sunlight, they can take CO2 and water and make their own sugar. Now for us, we don't have chloroplasts. So where do I get my glucose? I want glucose so I can change it into ATP, but where do I get that in the first place? So hopefully you've thought about it and realized that food, that's why we eat. Food gives us our energy for the cells. It provides us with glucose. Basically, anything that you eat with sugar, carbohydrates, all of that has glucose in it. So cellular respiration. This process is something that both plants and animals do, and they do it in their mitochondria. So in your notes, you're writing this down. Plants and animals both do cellular respiration, and they do it in their mitochondria. This is the process that releases energy by breaking down that sugar glucose molecule when oxygen is present. So cellular respiration, it's a process, just like photosynthesis is a process. It releases energy by breaking down that glucose that plants get through photosynthesis and the glucose that we get through eating when there's oxygen around. So just like photosynthesis had an equation, cellular respiration has an equation. So in your notes, this is when you have oxygen plus glucose yielding or making carbon dioxide, water, and energy, ATP energy. So write this down. Cellular respiration. Oxygen plus glucose, they're the ingredients or reactants, yield or make carbon dioxide, water, and energy, ATP. Now, if you're thinking, how am I going to remember all these equations? Well, cellular respiration is easy for me to remember because I just think of, what do my cells need? Cellular respiration takes place in my cells, so what do they need? Well, my cells need oxygen. I know that. So, one ingredient, reactant that I need is oxygen. I also know that my cells need sugar or energy, so glucose. I know my ingredients are then both oxygen and glucose. On the other hand, I know that something that is produced is carbon dioxide. When my cells go through this process, a waste product, or the thing that it makes, is carbon dioxide. When I exhale and release a breath, I know I'm breathing out carbon dioxide. I'm getting rid of the thing that was made when my cells do cellular respiration. I also know another product is water. If I were to look at my lovely self in the mirror and go along the glass, I would see it fog up, and that's because I'm breathing out some water. So another product that I need to get rid of because my cells made it is water. And then, of course, the whole point of doing cellular respiration is to get ATP energy. So, in order for me to remember this equation, is I know my cells need oxygen in, they need glucose in, they need to get the carbon dioxide out that they make, and they need to get the water that they make out. They also finally produce ATP energy, the kind of energy that we can use. So, just like photosynthesis, we have a chemical formula to memorize as well. So this would be 6 oxygens, 6 O2s, plus 1 glucose, C6H12O6, yields 6 carbon dioxides, 6 water, H2Os, and ATP. So I'll give you a chance to write this chemical formula down. 6O2 plus C6H12O6, the fancy form of glucose, produces 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O plus ATP. So when I take in oxygen, when I give my cells the glucose, I will produce carbon dioxide that I need to get rid of, oxygen, and ATP energy. So one thing I just wanted to clarify is that cellular respiration takes place in your cells all the time. Specifically, it's taking place in your mitochondria. Now, breathing, when I respire for that type of breathing, really, I'm just breathing in order to get my cells the ingredients it needs. So, I take in a breath to get in that oxygen, since that's an ingredient or a reactant. I breathe out CO2 because that's a waste product that's made when my cells are doing cellular respiration. So breathing, that's the physical thing my lungs are doing to get in the ingredients or get out the waste products. Cellular respiration is the chemical process that's happening in all of my cells. And one last thing about cellular respiration is that it's actually way more complicated than I'm making it sound, but all you need to know is that it's a process that allows me to get ATP energy when I have both glucose and oxygen. So moving on from here, you may wonder, well, how much ATP will I get from one glucose molecule? Well, one glucose molecule, one C6H12O6, gives you 38 ATP molecules. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. Long word, you don't really need to know it, except you do need to know is it gives you a ton of energy, because 1 gram, which is the equivalent of feeling like a paperclip in your hand, 1 gram of glucose gives you over 3,000 calories. That's like 30 cheeseburgers from just one glucose molecule. So thank goodness for cellular respiration because it gives us a ton of energy. So just to wrap it up, we have learned about both photosynthesis and cellular respiration today. Photosynthesis is when plants take in carbon dioxide from the air, water from, let's say, the ground with its roots, in the presence of light, will make glucose, sugar, as well as oxygen. We know that this takes place in the chloroplasts. So from there, plants can take that glucose and send it to the mitochondria. In the mitochondria, it goes through a process called cellular respiration. Now, of course, remember, humans, animals, we don't have chloroplasts to give us our glucose, so we consume other organisms to get that. So when I eat food, when I eat that celery, I get my glucose, and now I can go through cellular respiration. Cellular respiration takes place in both animal and plant cells, and that's where we have oxygen, glucose, yielding or making carbon dioxide, water, and ATP energy. So when you're looking at these two equations, these two processes, I want to know what you notice about them. So with your partner, I want you to figure out what are two things these equations have in common, and what are two things that are different about them. So if you're the partner closest to the windows, I want you to be in charge of figuring out what are two similarities these equations have. What's the same or close to the same in both? And if you're the partner away from the window, then I want you in charge of what's different. What's not exactly the same about these equations? What makes them different? So pause this video, talk to your partner, and let's hear some of your answers before we move on. Okay, so hopefully you noticed some things like that carbon dioxide is actually involved in both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Water is in both equations, glucose is in both equations, and oxygen is in both equations. So you might have noticed that the molecules are pretty much the same, just on different sides of the reaction. Furthermore, you might have noticed that the reactants, the ingredients for one, is the products for the other. So in photosynthesis, the ingredients, carbon dioxide and water, those are called the reactants, are the products, they're the thing that's made in cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide and water is on the left-hand side of photosynthesis. It's on the right-hand side of cellular respiration. If you look at the left-hand side of cellular respiration, that's oxygen and glucose, the ingredients. That's the products of photosynthesis, glucose and oxygen on the right-hand side. So something that makes them really similar is that they have the same molecules. What makes it different is that they're kind of the reverse of each other. They're switched on both sides. So another thing that you might have noticed that was different is that photosynthesis requires sunlight. And then on the other hand, cellular respiration produces something called ATP. So building off of this, the last thing we're going to do is on the back, you need to fill out this Venn diagram. A Venn diagram is where you can compare two things to see where they're different and where they're similar. So take a moment, fill out your Venn diagram, try it with your partner, figure out where these two processes take place, in what organelle, what do they need, what are the ingredients, what are the reactants, the things on the left-hand side of the equation, and what it makes, what are the things on the right-hand side of the equation that it produces. So take a moment, work with your partner, fill out the Venn diagram. So hopefully you and your partner came up with some similarities and differences. To go over the answers briefly, where photosynthesis takes place is in the chloroplast, whereas cellular respiration takes place in mitochondria. The ingredients, reactants, needs of photosynthesis are carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, and the plants produce both glucose and oxygen from that process. And then kind of the opposite, cellular respiration needs the glucose and the oxygen, and then it produces carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. Some things that they have in common, they're both processes, they both take place in organelles, they involve the same molecules, and they both involve some form of energy. So take a moment, jot these down, and that's it for your cell notes today. Thanks.